Hola, estudiantes. Today we are looking at queer theory now, and specifically we're looking at chapter 2, which is from Pathology to Pride, and it starts on page 22. So from Pathology to Pride. So this was kind of a really interesting chapter. It's about the history of queer theory in the sense of the development of homosexuality, both its terms, the pathology that occurs within medical science to indicate something being wrong, and then the counter discourses along with that negative narrative to embrace homosexuality as something to be proud of. And so this was a very interesting chapter. Starts off on page 22 with some very good questions. So it begins with, is queer theory always about sexuality? And to answer this question, it is crucial that we first ask, what is sexuality? And so we talked a little bit about this already. And there's different groups that would say yes or no about queer theory always being about sexuality. But I think the predominant answer to that question is yes. And then sexuality, the quick kind of definition for that is this notion of our sexual preferences, who we like and who we don't like and why. And then as you read on a little bit on that page 22, it talks about what's going to be discussed in the chapter. Ideas about assimilating with the general norm or transgressing the norm. Pride parades, this notion of homophile versus the later gay liberation movement. And then, of course, some discussions on intersectionality with race and class and ability and gender. So I think if you're looking for a good summary of what you're going to find in this chapter, 22 is it. So then we move on in the chapter to discussions from Foucault. So you don't get away from Foucault in a queer theory class. And I think that it's really important to just note the discussion that's actually in one of the key concepts boxes in this chapter on page 24, which is this notion of discourse. And so Foucault wants us to understand discourse as a social practice, and it occurs across multiple disciplines and in different contexts. And so when you have a more negative discourse, the powerful thing to note is it frees up the counter discourse, right? And so that's going to be talked about later on in this chapter. There's the repressive hypothesis, which is discussed on page 25. And I think that this one I was actually drawing some connections with our textbook, Queer There and Everywhere, and specifically about this, that there was a widespread belief, it's at the top of page 25, in thinking about sexuality, that by the 1800s, any prior openness had been supplemented by a Victorian bourgeoisie attitude towards sex, through which sexuality was carefully confined or repressed. And so I think about this in relation to the narrative that they have in this textbook about Abraham Lincoln and his friendships in his life, his male companionships. And so something as being taken more naturally or normalized by the 1800s, it's villainized almost. You can't talk about it anymore. And why is that, right? So as you continue on in this chapter, I think it's interesting to note that, like I mentioned earlier, the very negative pathologies within medicine that said that something was wrong with a person if they had homosexual tendencies actually, according to Foucault, freed up the discourse to allow it to transform itself with a counter narrative. And I do think that the pathology aspect is represented pretty well on page 27 with the table where it shows the mechanism, the what and the how, and then the subject that's produced. So just at the top of that, the hysterization of women's bodies. And they talked about how medical management for women's bodies and for reproduction purposes, that's what women were created for, right? And that's why homosexuality is seen as something that can be so transgressive, because it's not, number one concern is not about procreating per se. And then the subject that ends up being produced is the hysterical woman that has to be controlled and through medical science, right? And so that those examples are discussed on page 27 in that table. And so I think that just also helps us understand that binaries can't exist unless there's a counter to the binary. And so that's why the idea of, deviations at the bottom of page 26. Deviations are described in detail through both legal and medical texts. And while some irregularities or perversions come to be thought of as illnesses, they were treated as such. Others bore the brunt of legal sanctions. And then the establishment of this as being the norm, classification of specific deviations, ensured that, sexuality was controlled, right? And that the heterosexual body's task was to reproduce in order to create more people that could work towards a capitalist kind of notion. So Foucault describes that a lot, and the authors summarize Foucault's ideologies from page 26 and 27. And if you're moving on from that, we get to the word itself, homosexuality. And that's talked about on page 29 with the invention of homosexuality. So for that section, I think it's really good to indicate when that time period was, which was 1870 with the German psychiatrist. And that's discussed at the top on page 30. However, I don't think in that section, I think it's really just a lot of historical context. So I do think that you can gloss over some of the details discussed on page 30 and 32. But I do think that the key term that pathologize on page 31, this actually highlighted in a box, is pretty important to understand, since our modern iterations of pride ended up coming into fruition because of the countering of this kind of medical notion of pathologizing something. So let's see, some other key things to mention in this essay. Sedgwick, who we've talked about before, is discussed a little bit at the top of 35 to describe two other binaries of both universalizing and minoritizing ways of being in terms of homosexuality or not being a homosexual. So that's talked a little bit about at the top of 35. And I do think that the chapter takes a really exciting turn on page 36, where it talks about the fight for homosexual rights and the studies that were being done while the second sex is being written, while Dr. Alfred Kinsey's is writing their report on sexuality. And that leads us to what I talked about earlier, which is the homophile movement on page 38. And this was an early homosexual rights group, and it was coined in the 1920s, and it kind of fell out of disuse or disfavor, to use that term, in the 1960s, and was all about assimilating, about fitting in. We're like everybody else, we just like someone of the same sex, for instance. And so it was about becoming part of that dominant culture and that dominant narrative. And it wasn't until, I would say, the gay liberation movement with the New Left, and that's talked about on page 42 and 43, in which the rhetoric changed. It's no longer about assimilation. It's about visibility. It's about pride. It's about being different because we are different, and that's a good thing. And it's about coming out and pride marches. And there's a really, really good table that shows the distinctions between the goals of the early homosexual groups that were looking to change the way they were being treated in society versus the gay liberation movements. And that's at the top of page 43. I'm going to show you the little table here. So I would really look at that. And I mean, I think it's about countering these bad narratives, like at the top of page 42, that somehow homosexuality came to symbolize a threat to marriage, the family, civilization itself. They were, homosexuals were imagined as predatory, seductive, corrupting, promiscuous, gender deviant, and that's all at the top of 42. And so how do you counter that narrative? Well, you start creating your own discourses, and that's why we had that discussion with Foucault's use of the word discourse. And so then we get to the conformity versus confrontation, like I already mentioned, being gay as a political movement, coming out as a political movement. And you have the Stonewall riots that occur, and that's on June 28th, 1969, and that's discussed on page 44. And I think that, you see the distinction between the two groups coming out here as well, in terms of how the homophiles were saying to handle the riot, with their message at the top of page 45. We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village. And yet you had another whole group within that community saying, no, we're not going to be quiet. We're tired of these raids. We're tired of being arrested. We don't want these civil injustices and to keep happening. We want it to stop. And so I think that's really powerful. It's a really good section to pay a lot of attention to. Stonewall riots, page 44 through 45. And then the end of the chapter is really just about, liberation and pride movements around the world, globally, in other countries. You have a nice little box that summarizes it on page 50, the globalization of pride with Asia, Africa, Europe, South America. It talks about the continents and what kinds of events happen there. And in general, I mean, it's just very much about empowerment. What does it mean to take the power back from institutions that were using their power to control or to keep you in your place or something as a community? And I think the end pages here are just really, really powerful. And we'll discuss more in class or on Canvas. And if you have any further questions, reach out to me via Canvas email.